It was 1956. A radar station outside Leningrad hummed with the static of Cold War vigilance. The operators hunched over their green phosphor screens in dim Soviet light. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Voronin watched the sweep rotate, expecting the usual scatter of commercial airliners below 20,000 feet. Then something appeared that made no sense. A contact climbing past 40,000 feet, then 50, then accelerating upward where no aircraft should exist. Voronin reached for the phone. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the impossibility of what his equipment was telling him. The target was now cruising at 70,000 feet, higher than any Soviet interceptor could reach, higher than any known aircraft in the world. He reported it anyway, knowing his superiors would think the radar was malfunctioning. But the radar wasn't broken. An American U-2 spy plane was photographing Soviet missile installations from an altitude that transformed the entire concept of aerial warfare, and the men staring at those radar screens had just discovered they were defenseless. The Americans had done something the Soviets thought was aerodynamically impossible. They had built a camera platform that flew in the stratosphere, above the engagement ceiling of every fighter and missile in the Soviet arsenal. For the radar operators tracking these ghosts night after night, it wasn't just a technological surprise. It was a strategic humiliation broadcast across their screens in real time. Here's the question that haunted Soviet Air Defense Command for 4 years. How do you shoot down an aircraft flying at the edge of space when your missiles can't climb that high and your interceptors stall out at 55,000 feet? The answer would require rethinking everything Moscow believed about surface-to-air missile design, and it would end with a single missile strike over Sverdlovsk that changed the Cold War forever. If you're fascinated by the hidden technical battles that shaped history, hit subscribe. We're diving deep into the radar operators who watched helplessly, the engineers who built the impossible plane, and the Soviet weapons team that finally figured out how to reach it. The U-2 program began in a California hangar where Lockheed engineer Kelly Johnson sketched an aircraft that violated every rule of conventional design. The Air Force wanted a reconnaissance plane that could penetrate Soviet airspace without being detected or intercepted. Johnson's team delivered something stranger, a glider with a jet engine that could cruise for 9 hours at altitudes where the sky turned purple-black. The first prototype flew in August 1955. Test pilot Tony Levier climbed to 65,000 feet and looked down at a curvature of Earth that bomber crews would never see. At that altitude, air pressure was so low that an unpressurized human would die in 15 seconds. The aircraft itself was essentially a fuel tank with wings, so fragile that landing, it required a chase car calling out altitude because depth perception failed in the thin atmosphere. But it could photograph Soviet territory with a camera so powerful it could read license plates from 13 miles up. And for the first few overflights, Soviet radar operators could only watch as these American ghosts drifted across their screens in complete impunity. The first U-2 crossed into Soviet airspace on July 4, 1956. It flew from West Germany to Moscow, then turned southeast toward Ukraine before exiting through Iran. CIA analysts estimated the Soviets had no idea it was there. They were catastrophically wrong. Every radar station along the flight path tracked the intruder. Soviet fighter pilots scrambled in MiG-19s, climbing desperately toward an aircraft 20,000 feet above them. Some pilots pushed their engines so hard trying to reach the U-2 that they flamed out and crashed. The radar operators watched those interceptors stall and tumble back to Earth while the American plane continued serenely eastward. Air Defense Commander Sergei Biryuzov read the reports with mounting fury. His MiG-19s had a service ceiling of 55,000 feet. His S-75 Divina surface-to-air missiles could theoretically engage targets up to 65,000 feet, but only in perfect conditions with a direct upward shot. The U-2 was flying at 70,000 feet and turning, presenting a constantly changing angle that made missile guidance nearly impossible. Biryuzov ordered every radar station to track and report U-2 incursions. He wanted firing solutions calculated even if they were futile. He wanted his missile operators to understand exactly how outmatched they were. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev learned about the overflights 3 days later and exploded in rage, not at the Americans but at his own military for admitting they couldn't stop it. The psychological impact on Soviet air defense crews was devastating. Radar. Operators knew they were watching violations of their airspace in real time. Missile battery commanders had to explain to political officers why they weren't shooting. Fighter pilots risked their lives attempting impossible intercepts, while the American cameras photographed their attempts from above. Between 1956 and 1960, the U-2 flew at least 24 deep penetration missions over the Soviet Union. Each mission photographed hundreds of miles of sensitive territory: missile bases, submarine pens, nuclear facilities, bomber airfields. The CIA called it the greatest intelligence collection program in history. The Soviets called it an act of war they couldn't respond to. Soviet engineers knew their missiles could theoretically reach U-2 altitude, but theory and reality diverged sharply in 1956. The S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, used radio command guidance. A tracking radar locked onto the target. A computer calculated an intercept course, and ground controllers transmitted steering commands to the missile in flight. At extreme altitude, 3 problems compounded into failure. First, the missile's sustainer motor burned out after 22 seconds, requiring a nearly vertical launch trajectory to reach maximum altitude before running out of thrust. Second, the thin air at 70,000 feet provided almost no control surface authority, making the missile sluggish and imprecise. Third, the U-2's small radar cross-section and high altitude created a weak return signal that confused early guidance systems. Launch officer Viktor Bulatov participated in 6 failed intercept attempts in 1957. Each time, his battery fired missiles that climbed valiantly into the stratosphere, then tumbled uselessly as they lost guidance lock. He watched the U-2 continue its mission undisturbed. His commander submitted reports explaining the technical limitations. Moscow's response was always the same: try harder. What neither Bulatov nor his superiors initially understood was that the Americans had miscalculated too. Kelly Johnson designed the U-2 assuming Soviet radar couldn't track it effectively at extreme altitude. CIA mission planners believed they had created an invisible aircraft. The reality was more nuanced and ultimately more dangerous. Soviet radar could see the U-2 perfectly well. Every mission was tracked from penetration to exit. The Soviets simply couldn't hit what they could see. But they were learning. Soviet missile designers studied every failed intercept. They recovered missile telemetry data. They interviewed radar operators about signal strength and tracking stability. They examined photographs of missile contrails against the stratosphere. Gradually, they identified solutions. The breakthrough came from chief designer Pyotr Grushin's team at OKB-2. They couldn't make the missile reach higher, but they could make it more lethal in the thin air where the U-2 operated. The solution was a proximity fuse that detonated the warhead when passing within a specific range of the target, combined with a larger fragmentation warhead that created a wider kill radius. The modified S-75M entered service in 1959. It had a slightly improved sustainer motor and a new guidance package that maintained lock at extreme altitude. More importantly, it carried a warhead optimized for stratospheric interception. Where earlier missiles needed a direct hit against the fragile U-2, the new version could destroy it with a near miss. Soviet missile batteries began training with the modified system in winter 1959. Launch crews practiced firing profiles that maximized altitude intercept probability. Radar operators refined their tracking techniques to maintain lock on small, high-altitude targets. Air Defense Command selected the most experienced batteries and positioned them along likely U-2 flight corridors. The Americans had no idea the game had changed. CIA analysts noted increased Soviet missile activity but attributed it to expanded deployment rather than technical improvements. U-2 pilots continued flying their missions with the same altitude security they'd enjoyed since 1956. They flew too high to worry, too fast to intercept, and with camera systems that could photograph Soviet secrets with impunity. By April 1960, the Soviets had developed a tactical doctrine for U-2 engagement. Position multiple missile batteries along the predicted flight path, or coordinate their radars to maintain continuous tracking, and fire ripple salvos that created overlapping kill zones at 70,000 feet. It was a brute force solution to a technical problem, relying on probability and persistence rather than precision. One pilot was about to discover that probability eventually wins. May 1, 1960. Francis Gary Powers climbed into his U-2 at Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan, his pressure suit already uncomfortable in the morning heat. His mission called for a 9-hour flight across the Soviet Union from Pakistan to Norway, photographing missile sites and airfields across Russia's industrial heartland. It was Operation Grand Slam, the deepest U-2 penetration ever attempted. Powers lifted off at 6:26 a.m. local time. He climbed through the troposphere into stratospheric sunlight, the cockpit temperature dropping to freezing despite the external air temperature hovering around -70 degrees Celsius. At 70,000 feet, he leveled off and engaged the autopilot. Below him, Soviet radar operators began tracking. At the Sverdlovsk air defense sector, Major Mikhail Voronov watched the U-2 enter his coverage zone. Unlike earlier scrambles marked by confusion and desperation, this time he had orders and resources. 4 S-75M batteries had been positioned specifically for this intercept. Voronov coordinated their targeting data through a centralized command center, something Soviet air defense had never attempted against a U-2 before. Powers was 90 minutes into his mission. When the first missiles launched, he saw nothing from his cockpit. The missiles climbed almost vertically, accelerating to Mach 3 before their motors burned out. At 65,000 feet, they began guiding, their new proximity fuses armed and tracking. The first salvo missed, exploding 3,000 feet from Powers' aircraft. He felt the shockwave but attributed it to turbulence. The second salvo came 30 seconds later, fired from a battery 40 miles ahead. These missiles had a better intercept geometry, climbing into Powers' flight path rather than chasing from behind. One missile's proximity fuse detected the U-2 at a range of 150 feet. The warhead detonated. 70 pounds of high explosive and steel fragments expanded at 20,000 feet per second in the thin stratosphere. The blast wave was minimal in the rarefied air, but the shrapnel didn't need air pressure to kill. Powers felt the aircraft shudder, then nose over into an uncontrolled dive. His right wing had been shredded. The fuselage was punctured in a dozen places. The engine was dying. He reached for the destruct switches to activate the U-2's self-destruct system, then realized he was already falling and the mechanism might trap him in the disintegrating aircraft. He chose survival over security. Powers ejected at 64,000 feet, his pressure suit keeping him alive in an environment that would otherwise kill in seconds. His parachute opened at 15,000 feet. He drifted down toward a Soviet landscape that had just won its first victory against America's untouchable spy plane. The wreckage landed near the village of Kosulino. Soviet troops secured the site within 2 hours. The camera and film survived largely intact, proof of exactly what Powers had been photographing. So did Powers himself, captured by local militia before he could activate his suicide pill. Moscow had not only shot down the impossible aircraft, they had captured its pilot and its secrets. Voronov received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal for his role in coordinating the intercept. His radar operators and missile crews received commendations, but the real victory belonged to the engineers who had solved the technical problem: how to make a missile lethal at altitudes where conventional weapons failed. The CIA learned of Powers' shoot-down through radio intercepts 6 hours later. President Eisenhower initially authorized a cover story claiming a weather research aircraft had strayed off course. Then Khrushchev revealed that Powers was alive, talking, and that the Soviets had recovered the camera intact. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. A planned Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapsed. The Soviet Union demonstrated its captured U-2 wreckage to the international press. Powers stood trial in Moscow, creating propaganda that undermined American credibility for years. But the strategic impact went deeper. The shoot-down proved that altitude was no longer absolute protection. Soviet missiles could reach the stratosphere given proper deployment and coordination. The Americans immediately suspended all U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union. The era of impunity ended with a single missile strike over Sverdlovsk. For the radar operators who had spent 4 years tracking ghosts they couldn't touch, Powers' shoot-down represented validation. Their persistent tracking had provided the data that enabled the kill. Their documentation of missile failures had driven the technical improvements. Soviet air defense had evolved from helpless observers to effective interceptors through systematic analysis of their own inadequacy. The U-2 continued flying reconnaissance missions over other countries for decades, eventually transitioning to standoff surveillance where it remained outside hostile airspace. But it never again penetrated deep into Soviet territory at 70,000 feet. That tactical option died with Powers' aircraft. What the Soviet radar operators didn't know as they celebrated was that American engineers were already building something far more difficult to intercept. The SR-71 Blackbird, designed to fly at 85,000 feet and Mach 3.2 fast enough that even improved missiles would struggle to catch it. The altitude race would become a speed race, pushing both sides into increasingly extreme engineering solutions. But that's another story of stunned radar operators watching impossible aircraft on their screens. The difference was that next time the Americans would learn from Soviet persistence, rather than assuming technological superiority guaranteed invulnerability. The U-2 incident taught both superpowers a critical lesson about Cold War engineering. No advantage is permanent when your opponent is willing to fail repeatedly until they succeed. Soviet missile crews fired hundreds of unsuccessful intercepts before achieving that single kill. Over Sverdlovsk, American designers assumed altitude alone would protect their aircraft indefinitely. Soviet radar operator testimonies from declassified archives reveal the psychological reality of those 4 years. They described watching the U-2 cross their screens with the helpless frustration of guards watching an intruder they couldn't reach. Some operators volunteered for extra shifts, obsessively tracking and documenting each overflight as if dedication could compensate for technical inadequacy. Their persistence created the data that enabled the kill. Every tracked mission provided velocity profiles, altitude variations, turn rates, and radar cross-section characteristics. This information fed directly into the missile improvements that eventually worked. The radar operators watching those screens night after night weren't just witnesses to American superiority, they were unwitting data collectors for the engineering solution. Senior Lieutenant Voronin, who tracked that first 1956 overflight near Leningrad, later testified that he never doubted Soviet missiles would eventually reach the U-2. He simply didn't know how many years it would take. His testimony reveals a distinctly Soviet approach to technical challenges. Accept temporary inferiority, document the gap systematically, and commit to closing it through iteration rather than innovation. This wasn't the American method of seeking revolutionary breakthroughs. It was incremental improvement driven by operational failure. Every missed intercept prompted another design modification, another tactical adjustment, another training evolution. The S-75M that killed Powers' U-2 wasn't radically different from the original S-75. It was just better optimized for the specific scenario Soviet operators had experienced dozens of times. The Americans made the opposite miscalculation. They achieved a revolutionary breakthrough with the U-2's altitude capability, then assumed that breakthrough would remain unchallenged because it seemed impossible to counter. CIA analysts knew the Soviets were tracking the missions but dismissed the threat because previous intercept attempts had failed. They treated technological advantage as static rather than temporary. Powers' shoot-down didn't just end U-2 overflights, it fundamentally changed American intelligence collection strategy. The CIA accelerated satellite reconnaissance development, creating systems that truly were untouchable, because they orbited above the atmosphere entirely. The Corona satellite program, which had been progressing slowly as a backup to the U-2, suddenly became the primary intelligence platform. Soviet success also validated a strategic approach that would define their military development for decades. When faced with American technological superiority, the Soviet response was to study the advantage, identify its limitations, and develop counters through persistent iteration. This pattern repeated with stealth, aircraft, cruise missiles, and eventually missile defense systems. The radar operators who tracked those early U-2 missions never became famous. Their names don't appear in most Cold War histories, but their nightly logs of impossible aircraft cruising across their screens provided the empirical foundation for the missile improvements that eventually worked. They were the human sensors in a learning system, and their frustration drove the technical evolution. Powers himself spent 21 months in Soviet custody before being exchanged for KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel in 1962. He returned to a mixed reception in America, with some viewing him as a victim of impossible circumstances, and others questioning why he didn't destroy his aircraft and commit suicide rather than allow capture. He eventually flew as a test pilot and traffic reporter before dying in a helicopter crash in 1977. His shoot-down remains the definitive moment when Cold War air superiority shifted from altitude to speed. The next generation of reconnaissance aircraft didn't fly higher, they flew faster, understanding that neither characteristic alone guaranteed survivability. The SR-71 Blackbird combined both, flying at 85,000 feet and Mach 3.2, creating an intercept problem that Soviet missiles never fully solved. But the fundamental lesson from that May morning over Sverdlovsk endured. In the Cold War, your opponent is always watching, always learning, and always working to negate your advantage. The stunned Soviet radar operators tracking those first U-2 overflights eventually stopped being stunned and started being effective. Their persistence across hundreds of failed intercepts created the conditions for eventual success. American intelligence assessments after Powers' shoot-down revealed how badly the CIA had misjudged Soviet capabilities. Internal documents admitted that analysts had become complacent about U-2 survivability, treating the altitude advantage as absolute rather than temporary. The assumption that Soviet missiles couldn't reach 70,000 feet wasn't wrong technically, it was wrong operationally, because it ignored the possibility of incremental improvements that made kills probabilistic rather than impossible. Soviet Air Defense Commander Biryuzov wrote in his classified memoir that he never believed the U-2 was truly invincible. He described it as a difficult target requiring better tactics and improved weapons, not an impossible target requiring revolutionary new technology. That mindset difference proved decisive. The Americans built an aircraft assuming perfection was achievable. The Soviets built a kill chain assuming good enough was sufficient. The technical specifications of the final intercept illustrate how narrow the margin was. The missile that hit Powers' aircraft detonated 150 feet from the fuselage. At sea level, that distance would have been survivable for a conventional aircraft. CV, 70,000 feet in the thin air, the shrapnel retained enough velocity to shred the U-2's fragile structure. The kill wasn't inevitable, it was probabilistic, achieved by firing multiple missiles from optimal positions until one got close enough. Powers estimated the Soviets fired 14 missiles at him during his 30-minute transit through the Sverdlovsk air defense zone. Most missed by thousands of feet. 2 came close enough to detect. 1 scored the kill. That's a 7% success rate, which would be unacceptable in most military contexts, but was sufficient to end U-2 overflights forever. The radar operators tracking that mission didn't know they were witnessing the end of an era. They called out tracking data, watched the missile launches, and observed the target altitude suddenly dropping. Only when Powers' parachute appeared on radar did they realize they'd finally achieved what 4 years of attempts had failed to accomplish. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of viewer who appreciates these deep dives into Cold War technical history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of impossible engineering and the persistent operators who learned to counter it. The aftermath of Powers' shoot-down accelerated American satellite reconnaissance, but also introduced a new vulnerability. Satellites followed predictable orbits that Soviet ground stations could track precisely. The U-2 had flown irregular routes at uncertain times, making pre-positioning of defenses difficult. Satellites might be untouchable, but they were also predictable, allowing the Soviets to hide sensitive activities during overhead passes. This paradox defined Cold War intelligence collection for the next 3 decades. Perfect survivability through altitude came at the cost of tactical flexibility. The U-2 could fly anywhere, but was vulnerable. Satellites were invulnerable, but could only photograph along predetermined tracks. Neither solution was ideal, both were necessary. Soviet propaganda exploited the Powers incident relentlessly. Khrushchev displayed the wreckage at Gorky Park, allowing Soviet citizens to see proof that American technological superiority wasn't absolute. The trial proceedings were broadcast, showing Powers admitting to espionage charges. The message was clear. Soviet engineering had overcome American arrogance. What the propaganda didn't mention was how desperately close the Soviets had come to never achieving that kill. If Powers had flown his mission 6 months earlier, before the improved S-75M missiles were deployed, he would have completed it successfully. If his route had deviated slightly, taking him between battery positions instead of over them, the intercept probability would have dropped to near zero. The victory was real, but contingent. American U-2 pilots who flew later missions over Cuba, China, and other territories always knew that Powers' shoot-down changed the risk calculus. They couldn't assume altitude alone would protect them. Some pilots reported increased stress knowing that any country with Soviet missile systems could potentially replicate the Sverdlovsk intercept. The psychological advantage the U-2 provided its pilots evaporated with that single shoot-down. The final irony is that the U-2 remains in service today, still flying reconnaissance missions at 70,000 feet. Modern versions have better engines, improved sensors, and defensive systems that give warning of missile launches. But they fly in permissive airspace only, avoiding any country with modern surface-to-air missiles. The aircraft that once penetrated the most heavily defended airspace in the world now operates only where it's welcome. The stunned Soviet radar operators who first tracked the U-2 in 1956 eventually became confident missile directors who developed kill tactics. Their journey from helplessness to effectiveness took 4 years and hundreds of failed intercepts, but persistence prevailed over innovation, iteration defeated revolution, and the impossible aircraft became just another target. That's the real lesson from 70,000 feet over Sverdlovsk. In Cold War engineering, no advantage lasts forever when your opponent refuses to accept defeat. The Americans built an untouchable aircraft. The Soviets learned to touch it, and the radar operators who watched it all unfold went from stunned witnesses to victorious participants in the ongoing battle between technology and counter-technology. The Cold War would produce many more cycles of advantage and counter-advantage. Each side would stun the other with capabilities that seemed impossible to defeat. And each time, persistent operators and determined engineers would eventually find the weakness in what appeared invincible. The U-2 was just the first lesson in a decades-long seminar on how superiority is always temporary when your opponent is always learning.